Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Kabatagway. Violence has once again erupted in the occupied Palestinian territories. Israeli forces have attacked Palestinians protesting against the planned eviction of several families from their homes in East Jerusalem, al-Quds. Why does this continue after Israel suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the resistance fighters and the rockets that came from the Gaza Strip? In this debate, we'll discuss the tense situation that remains in Jerusalem, al-Quds, while the U.S. Secretary of State is visiting the region. First, let's cross on over to the occupied Ramallah. Mona Kantil is our correspondent joining us in order to find out what is going on there. Ramallah, obviously tensions still remain there. Tell us what neighborhoods, what's going on, and what has transpired.
Well, what's happening, the same case of Palestinians living in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, al-Quds. Today, Israeli court in Jerusalem, al-Quds, postponed its decision on an appeal lodged by 7 Palestinian families from Batn al-Hawa neighborhood in Silwan in East Jerusalem, al-Quds. The Israeli court have decided that 86 Palestinian families should leave their homes, or mainly their homes would be they would be forced expelled out from their homes in Batn al-Hawa neighborhood in order to allow for Israeli settlers to live in their homes. As you have mentioned, Palestinians have protested outside the court today against the Israeli ruling. However, the Israeli forces have attacked the Palestinian families and the protesters who were supporting the families from Batn al-Hawa neighborhood. The Israeli regime claims that these homes are owned by Jewish settlers from the Atarat Kohanim Foundation. This foundation works to strengthen a Jewish presence in East Jerusalem, al-Quds, and those Palestinian families used to live in the old town of Jerusalem, al-Quds, in 1965 before the occupation of the eastern part of Jerusalem, al-Quds, and then they moved to Batn al-Hawa. Now the Israeli settlers want to occupy their homes and to expel them from their homes. The court have postponed the hearing. However, another hearing could be expected in the coming weeks, like the situation of Sheikh Jarrah residents.
Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. Mona Kantil talking to us from occupied Ramallah. Our guest joining us for this debate, we have Daniel Jejic, who's an author and researcher, joining us from Beirut. And we also have Richard Becker, author of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire. I'd like to welcome you both. Daniel Jejic, let me first start with you. Looking at the tensions, as our correspondent just explained, of how it still exists, and also Jerusalem al-Quds, East Jerusalem al-Quds, included in this major flashpoints before the war broke out. Why do you think Israel continues with these evictions, which have resulted in clashes, not to mention the possibility of it breaking out into another war? If we want to have a flashback here, the evictions in courts were actually postponed when Israel saw the height of the violence that broke out, at the height where there were lots of clashes taking place.
If you look at the structure of Israel's policies, it pretty much depends on these so-called evictions and continued expulsion of Palestinians, because the official goal of the policy is, of course, to remove Palestinians, who are the indigenous people, from not only Jerusalem, but from all of Palestine, in order to increase settlement activities and to increase the colonies and the colonization of Palestine. Now, it's continuing, of course, because to some extent, after the so-called ceasefire, the topic has, to some extent, disappeared from the diplomatic discourse and from much of the media reporting in the West, so that there is less attention being paid to the continuity of these actions. But they haven't started recently, and they're not going to stop, because it is a continuous and structural ethnic cleansing that the Israeli regime is conducting in East Jerusalem and beyond.
We hear about that, Richard Becker, like the words that I guess they're used, ethnic cleansing. Amnesty International coming out saying that these eviction orders, another example of what they say is Israel's criminal policy of forced displacement of Palestinians. What are the Israelis exactly doing? What is their main purpose behind these evictions, and what they're exercising there on the ground?
Well, there's one main objective on part of the Israeli government. There are many tactics that pursue this objective, but the objective is to remove as many of the Palestinians from Palestine as possible. That's their objective. Their objective, and they even talked about this in the days right after the 1967 war. It's been documented by the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé that in the cabinet meetings that took place at that time, there was a discussion going on about how Israel could now annex the West Bank that it had just conquered in a surprise attack on Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. They also had taken over Gaza at that time. But they had this idea: how can we annex the land without the people, and not annex the people? So this has been going on for a very, very long time. And I think it's taken a long time for the world to see it. But in these particularly grotesque incidences where the settlers show up in East Jerusalem, which was under Jordanian rule at the time, up until the 1967 war, and claim that even though the Palestinians who have lived there for generations now in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, that somehow the settlers have a right to take their land. And this is backed up by the courts, it's backed up by the police, it's backed up by the military, and it's backed up by the Israeli government itself. And that's what the objective is. The objective is to ethnically cleanse the area and replace the indigenous people with those who have come to settle in what they call Israel.
Well, Daniel, we are looking at the Palestinian factions and Hamas just in the past days. They have held their celebratory occurrences that they've had on a number of occasions, marking this very important milestone that they have seen as a success in terms of the ceasefire happening and in terms of the rockets and the goal that they had, which resulted in that ceasefire. Now, they have issued a warning because of the clashes that happened, that began that war ultimately in al-Quds. I don't know if you recall, they issued a warning and they said by 6 p.m., if Israel doesn't stop what it's doing, which included the evictions also at Sheikh Jarrah, that they were going to fire the rockets. Israel is still continuing doing what it's doing. Isn't Israel afraid that there may be rocket attacks coming from the Gaza Strip, and then we go back to square one here?
It's a good question. I mean, effectively, if we look at the structure of all of this, I think it's inevitable at some point, because Israel's policies are violent in their structure. So they are violating Palestinian human rights and are continuously evicting people and expelling them from their homes. It would be difficult to imagine that they wouldn't be expecting any sort of reaction. But I guess one of the major issues that they face, as you mentioned, and with the victory that Hamas claimed, is of course the question how Israel is going to react to that and whether it would make a difference for them, because effectively these policies are going to continue and they're recreating new forms of containment and control to contain Palestinians. But of course there is a rise in so-called tension now that it's in many ways unprecedented.
Richard Becker, if we want to take a look at the U.S. now, we know that the U.S. Secretary of State is in the region. He's staying here, I guess, in the region for a number of days. No surprise that he has claimed his complete support for Israel, the U.S.'s complete support, that Israel has a right to defend itself. His trip is meant to, according to how the news is meant to have the ceasefire hold. When we take a look at the importance that the U.S. has placed, this trip being one example of it, a quick question comes to mind, aside from the support that the U.S. has said it's going to give to Gazans, to Palestinians, that it's going to rebuild the relationship, it's going to reopen a consulate in Jerusalem, give millions in aid to help the Gaza Strip. Why doesn't it come out and lift the blockade on the Gaza Strip and ask Israel to do that?
Well, I think that we can see that the Blinken, the Secretary of State Blinken, in his trip, repeating that familiar mantra, that all of them say in Washington, Israel has a right to defend itself. They never say that the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves when they're being attacked by settlers or being attacked by, masked police forces or the military in the West Bank or the airstrikes on Gaza. They never use that expression in regard to the Palestinians, but clearly they are very worried. I think Washington is very worried right now about again the Palestinians have been kind of counted out. The Abraham Accords were just going to go around the Palestinians and the Palestinian people and solve all the problems in the Middle East and not have to take them into account. And what, in a certain way, I think is the most important thing that just happened, in addition to the joining in on a mass scale of Palestinians from inside the 1948 borders of Israel, is that the Palestinians affirmed once again that they will not be sidelined, they will not be left out of what's going on. So now the U.S. reaction to that, Blinken and Biden and all the rest of them, is to now rush in and try to rescue, now having to take into account that the Palestinians are not going away and not going to be sidelined, to try to strengthen the organization that the U.S. most supports in the region, which is the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, which has lost a great deal of credibility over a long period of time, but I think especially in regard to the events that just took place. So they're saying, well, we're going to help rebuild Gaza, but we're not going to deal with Hamas. Well, Hamas is the governing party, and how is that going to work? Well, I think what they'll try to do is go around dealing with Hamas for sure. But they're doing a number of different things right now, which are intended to try to bolster the Abbas government and the Palestinian Authority.
Well, Daniel Judge, we had the senior leader of the Palestinian resistance movement, Yahya Sinwar, today say that if the violations against al-Quds and Palestinians continue, it's not going to think twice about sending rockets into Israel. And he said that there was actually a plan to send, from what he said, about 300 rockets simultaneously into Haifa and Tel Aviv. But that plan was scrapped at the last second due to the depth of the destruction that it would bring, amongst other factors that were taken into consideration. Does that, what does that exactly place Israel in the bigger picture here? And at the same time, what do you think it shows in terms of the depth of the military reach that the Palestinian factions have when it comes to Israel?
Yeah, I think it shows the resilience that the Palestinian factions and Palestinians in general continue to resist, and to resist not only the physical aggression and violence, but also the policies that try to silence them and also police them and police the ways in which they express their resistance. But also from a military perspective, it shows the Zionist regime that it is probably not as strong as it presents itself or thinks it is, and that Palestinians are still there. It also reaffirms the presence of the indigenous people to the settler community, and to some extent continues also this threat that the colony poses, which is effectively based on a very fragile narrative, and it's a highly militarized society that, after all, is there as a colony, whereas Palestinians are, of course, both the fractions you mentioned, but also just in general, have, I guess, to an extent, also the will to survive on their land and to return. So even here, the intentions of confrontation are very different among Palestinians and for the Zionist regime, and I think this is what continues to weaken the Zionist regime in many ways.
Yeah, Richard Becker, the senior leader of the Palestinian resistance movement, Yahya Sinwar, also made another very interesting comment when he was addressing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and I do have to mention that Israel actually has an announcement that it made that it would have a hit out on Yahya Sinwar. So he is obviously being very bold and coming out, actually making himself present in the way they did it. Anyways, he said that when asked or when addressing how all this will end, how the Palestinian resistance factions and Hamas would stop with rocket attacks, with their hostility. He said all Israel has to do is to follow the UN resolutions. And when you think about that, it's an international body that issued those resolutions. How likely is it for Israel to follow any of those resolutions?
As long as Israel has the protection of the United States, because this is very important, is that it's not just, I mean, the $3.8 billion or more a year that goes to the state of Israel in military aid is very important. There's other monies that flow from the United States from private sources as well. So that's important. But I think even more important is that Israel is under the U.S. Umbrella of protection. It's part of the U.S. empire. The book that I did, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, was premised on that idea that really Israel is a vital cog in the U.S. military machine. The world, it's a very big world out there, and for the U.S. is trying to dominate the entire globe. It has military commands for the entire globe, but it doesn't have the forces on its own. It needs some allies who are subject to it. And it has them, and Israel is one, and Israel is right in the center of the Middle East. I would, I think it's in the center of the Middle East in a geographical sense, and I think it's in the center of the Middle East in terms of the consciousness of the Arab people and the other peoples of the Middle East. And so what happens there is very, very important, and I think that's another reason why we see Blinken over there now, is that they know that what happens to the Palestinians, what happens in occupied Palestine, has the potential to very much affect the entire region.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things, Daniel, when it comes to the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is this military aid that our guest there, Richard Becker, talked about. And when you think about it, the U.S. gives Israel military aid. The string attached to that is that it needs to purchase its military equipment from the U.S. So when you put things into context, when you have a war that we just did, that they just had, and you have the Iron Dome missile system, have these rockets coming from the Gaza Strip that the interceptors need to go out in order to thwart it or to block it, each one of those costs between $50,000 to $100,000. Just one example of how the U.S. in turn has its military manufacturers make the money that it's indirectly, again, sending in the form of military aid. Not much of an incentive for the U.S. to want to stop a war that it's making money from.
Absolutely. And I mean, in many ways, Israel is a proxy for the United States, and Palestine, in particular Gaza, has been turned into a laboratory where weapons are tested. There is a very strong exchange, not just in military, but also in police tactics and strategies of policing weapons, as you mentioned, between the United States and the Zionist regime. So there is an economic and military component that is very important for both of them, and also informs the very existence of that relationship. So definitely it does provide a benefit if there is a continuous, shall I say, usage of those mechanisms that are being invested in.
Yep, Richard Becker just interviewed Richard Falk days ago, the former special coordinator for the Palestinian territories. I don't know if you recall who he is. What he said about this topic of U.S. military aid, U.S. equipment being used by Israel in the Gaza Strip was very interesting. He said that Israel actually uses new equipment that the U.S. sells it on the Gaza Strip in the wars, in particular, like the one that just passed. And he said that some of this new technology that's being used, or new equipment that's being used, is then sold or resold, I should say, to other countries. So it profits from experimenting with this new equipment and technology in the war. And that's pretty fascinating in a negative sense if you think about it.
Yeah, and if you go to Washington, D.C., and just next to it is Crystal City, and Crystal City is right by the Pentagon, and Crystal City has Raytheon and Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and all their offices, these bright shiny offices are there, and there's a revolving door. And so they got close with the Pentagon so that they don't have to walk too far to get to the revolving door. Of generals and admirals and lobbyists and executives from the military. So it's all tied together there. Of course, this is, and it's very, very true that for a long time, the U.S. has had Israel test out some of its new weapon systems on the Palestinians or on Lebanon as well. And so this has been going on a long time. It's corrupt and immoral and unjust in every way that you can think of it. But that's the reality of the situation.
Okay, my final question goes to you, Daniel, if you can. Briefly, what is next here? We know that Israel is on the back foot in a sense. The ceasefire is not something that Hamas has said that they wanted to do, but they weren't the ones that requested it. They said it's an unconditional ceasefire. Israel is now looking weak on the international stage because of the condemnations. So, what can we expect here to happen?
Good question. I mean, we had similar situations before. I think not to that extent, but I think that the diplomatic discourse and the media narratives play an important role. Having less attention being paid to Israel and its actions obviously gives it more space to continue those. But also, Israel is confronted with a resistance that is organized not only in Palestine but beyond in the region, where various resistance movements are coordinating and have been coordinating with the Palestinian resistance. So Israel is definitely facing threats that it hasn't faced before. So it will probably have to extend its support on the United States. It remains to be seen what is going to happen, but it does definitely have to. I mean, Israel didn't really have a strategy when it was bombarding Gaza other than just bombarding people and killing them. And in the long run, of course, it needs to be seen what's going to happen. But I think it is faced with a resistance that is stronger than it was before.
Thank you for that. We appreciate it, Daniel Jejic, author and researcher. I'd like to thank Richard Becker, also author of Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire. And we have correspondent Monica Kandil at the top of the debate. That does it for this edition of the debate. When we cover Taway, entire team is goodbye until next time.